All right, welcome to the first of our set of recorded lectures for AP Environmental Science. We're going to start out with the first major topic that is in the course description, and it's Introduction to Ecosystems. So before we get started, well, one, enjoy reading the cartoon, and two, let's consider a situation. So we're going to consider this situation. You're at home and you've got a pizza and you're just about to sit down to eat. You should feel like, hey, I got plenty of food to eat. I've got a whole pizza. And seeing as how that pizza looks larger than the person themselves, looks like you've got plenty to eat. And by the way, I apologize. My cats will meow in the background when they hear me talking. Now, let's say your friend comes over and your friend's like, hey, I smelled that pizza from down the hall. It smells pretty good and I'm really hungry. Would you mind sharing with me? You're a nice friend and you've got a huge pizza. So you're like, sure. Okay, I'll share. But then your friend says, oh, and I brought my little sister with me. Is it okay if they have some pizza too? You're like, well, I don't know. And then you're like, oh, and I brought my boyfriend too. You're starting to think, wow, this is a lot of people trying to eat my pizza. And then they bring their cat, and the cat is giving you some dead-eyed stares saying, I want that pizza. At this point, do you still feel willing to share? Do you still feel like you'll get enough of your pizza to satisfy your hunger? At this point, you might very well say, no, 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 no. That's too many of y'all. Y'all need to get out. This pizza is mine. What we just went through was an example of a resource, something that is necessary for an organism to live. In this case, it was food for you. And it can vary depending on the organism. If you're a plant, a producer, autotroph, all same thing, then you could be needing sunlight, water, nutrients in your soil. If you are a consumer, it could be that you need prey, you may need water, you may need shelter. And the availability of these resources will influence how species interact. And this can be interactions within a species, which would be intra-specific competition, which is what you had with you and your friend and their sister and their boyfriend. Or it can be interspecific competition, which would have been between you and that cat. One way to remember this is inter usually means like in between. So that's going to be between two species. And then I usually remember intra is the one within a species, inside a species. And when less resources are available, you'll find that competition increases. So, it could have been that your friend was like, okay, let's kick out the cat and the boyfriend. And then, will you let me share your pizza? So your competition increases, so you try and get rid of some of the competition. So this leads us into interactions between organisms. How do organisms interact with each other? Well, one relationship that they tend to have is predation. In a predator-prey relationship, you have the predator who does the eating and usually hunts the prey, and the prey who is usually trying to avoid getting eaten. So the predator hunts and eats the other organism. The prey is captured as a food source. Predation may be thought of, you may have seen some of those Planet Earth videos that you watch and thought to yourself, oh my god, no, they're chasing down the cute little animals. Oh, predators are evil. But predators are useful for prey populations. They do things like kill some of the sicker animals, the weaker animals, and the old animals, which allows the population that remains greater access to food and other resources. It also acts as kind of like an evolutionary pressure, and it can improve like the genetic pool of that group of organisms. And we'll talk a little bit more about adaptations later. So predators and prey, since they interact with each other, they influence each other's populations. So in Canada, there was a 90-year period or so where they were taking track of the populations of Canadian lynxes, which are the lovely cats over, where's my cursor? Over here. And snowshoe hares, which are the favorite prey of those Canadian lynxes. And when they measured their population over a 90-year period, they showed these cycles of fluctuations. And a fluctuation is a change, like usually kind of back and forth. If things fluctuate, they may go between two numbers. So kind of change up and down. And if you look at a graph of these populations, what you'll see is every time there is a peak in the hare population, there is very shortly after a peak, let's change color here, in the predator population. So right here, and right here. But notice that there is a lag. There is a delay in between the increase in the the prey population and the increase in the predator population. So if we look at just kind of a generalized image of this, it makes sense. If you have a lot of food, your population will tend to increase. So when we're at this point right here, and our population of prey is increasing, the predators have plenty of food so they can reproduce and all their babies survive. That means their population starts growing. But when there are more predators, the prey start to die off because they get eaten by the predators. So the population of the prey starts to decrease. Once the population of prey decreases, well, less predators have food, and so some of them start to die off. Once there are less predators, that's less pressure on the prey population, so they start to reproduce more, have more babies, and increase their population, which then allows the predator population to increase as well. So notice that there's this lag or delay in between the peaks of the prey population and the peaks of the predator population. So there's this lag right here. But that the prey population and the predator population are directly impacting each other. And they kind of form this kind of balance if there aren't any other factors involved, where they'll fluctuate kind of around this kind of constant. There'll be a maximum to the population and a minimum, but it's not like they're gonna like overshoot their carrying capacity. If you remember what carrying capacity is, we'll talk more about it later. So sometimes predators may eat up all of the organisms of their prey species, and usually they have one prey species that they're like, this one's yummy, I really like to eat this. So if you want to go stereotypical, bears might be very partial to honey. Think of Winnie the Pooh. However, if that honey becomes scarce because the bears have all eaten it, then usually a lot of predators are generalists, meaning that they don't need like super specific conditions to survive. They're adaptable. And so what they can do is they can do what's called prey switching and switch to some other food source. So that way they don't starve to death, and they also don't eat their food source to extinction. Predators also have a bunch of adaptations, different ways to catch prey. So if you look on the right, what you're looking at is, this is baleen, which is these hairy bristles that stick down from the gums of whales. What whales do to eat, these kind of bulk feeding whales, they open their mouth, they take in a huge amount of water, they close their mouth, and then they push the water out through the baleen, but anything that's kind of bigger than water is going to end up sticking inside their mouth. They swallow that down, and they've got large amounts of these tiny creatures that they're able to eat. That is a specialized adaptation for being able to eat these tiny creatures without having to, like eat each individual one, which would take forever. You'd never get a whale to grow to like the huge size that they grow to, with them trying to pick and eat each krill or copepod. There are also some behavioral strategies. So here we see some dolphins. And let me change the pen color so you can actually see it. So here we see some dolphins, and dolphins will do something where they will swim around a school of fish. They'll work together and cooperate in order to group the fish into like this kind of dense ball, and then they'll just swim through and snack on some fish as they go through. So they work together and cooperate in order to catch their prey. You can think of classic predators like lions, tigers. They have teeth and claws that allow them to catch prey, and think of snakes when you want to think of venom. So all of these interactions between organisms we can call symbioses. Symbiosis is just a term for a long-term interaction between two species that are in an ecosystem. So it's not like, oh, hey, this species bumped into this other species. It's, okay, we're going to have this relationship that we act out day after day, week after week. There are four major types of symbiosis that we're going to look at. The traditional ones, which hopefully you've covered in another class, are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, which here they're calling exploitation. And then competition is also a type of symbiosis. What changes between these is which species benefit and which species are harmed. And we're going to look at each of these in more detail, but a mutualism is going to be everybody benefits, plus plus. Or sometimes I put smiley face, smiley face. Commensalism, one species benefits and the other species isn't really affected. Exploitation or parasitism, one species benefits and the other is harmed. And in competition, we're going to talk about why everybody's harmed. Nobody wins when there's competition. We're not talking sports. So let's look at mutualism. There are a couple of types of mutualism. You can have a facultative mutualism, where the two species help each other out, but they can technically survive without each other. So plants and pollinators are like that. Technically, the pollinators could find some other food source, and the plants could, say, get pollinated by wind. They may not do as well without the other species, but they are technically capable of surviving. On the other hand, there's also obligatory mutualism, and this happens when two or more species absolutely need each other. They've become so intertwined, so interconnected, that they will die if they are without their partner. And an example of this is lichen, which we'll talk about more on this slide. So let's look at a couple of mutual relationships. First, let's look at cleaner wrasse fish and larger fish. So this brightly colored little guy here is a cleaner wrasse fish. You may have seen them in some movies. They clean other fish and they take off parasites. They get a food source, and the larger fish that they're cleaning gets the benefit of having these parasites removed. So they're getting the harm done by that parasite taken away. Then lichen are one or two species of fungi and some either green algae or cyanobacteria, which are a type of bacteria that do photosynthesis. And what they do is they live together, like here you see in this picture, these are individual algae cells that are living within the body of the fungus. So the fungus gets the products of photosynthesis, sugar. So it's getting fuel, it's getting food, while the algae gets water and nutrients from the fungus. The fungus also is capable a lot of times of, they can break down rock and extract some of the nutrients from it, which is then made available to the algae. Commensalism, I call it whatevs, because one species doesn't really have any effect from this. So there are multiple ways you can have commensalism. What you see up here is an example of a plant using another organism for transportation. So that is a burr, which I happen to have a lot of in my backyard. They are not in a commensal relationship with me because they cause me pain when I step on them. However, if you had a thick coat of fur, or if these attach to your fur, to your clothes, you probably wouldn't even notice if you had these stuck to you. They would get a free ride to wherever you're going. You'd see it, brush it off, and you wouldn't really be affected. Organisms can also use each other for housing. So here we see a picture of an epiphyte. Epi means on top of, and phyte means plant. So it's a plant growing on top of another plant. This is an orchid, and orchids are very common in tropical forests where it's super high competition to get space and get access to light. So what orchids do is they'll grow on a tree branch, like what you see here, and they get to be higher up, get more access to light, but they don't take anything from the host tree. They just sit on it. And they're not blocking its access to light, they're not taking its nutrients, so that's a commensalism. And then you can also have organisms use something that another organism made after it dies. So hermit crabs, for example, will use shells made by other organisms called gastropods. Once those gastropods have died, and then they'll take over those shells and live in them. So the gastropod isn't killed by the hermit crab. It's just the gastropod dies, its shell is out there, and the hermit crab's like, ooh, this is a nice house. I'm going to live here. Just a quick note about commensalism. Usually with a lot of these relationships, the more you study, the more you find out they're not actually commensalism. You'll end up finding out that they're either mutualism or parasitism. So like when I first started teaching, both of these examples were examples I taught as commensalism, and now they're, after more research, classified as mutualism. So clownfish and sea anemones, if you remember from Finding Nemo, clownfish will tend to clean around the sea anemone, and that helps benefit the anemone, and the clownfish may also get bits of prey that the anemone didn't finish up, and it gets protection. So that's mutualism. It was thought before that the clownfish didn't really benefit the anemone, and more research showed that, oh, it actually does. Then on the right, what you see here is you see a shark with several remora, and remora are fish that tend to attach to sharks. It was thought that they just kind of went along for the ride, and sharks are kind of messy eaters, so they'd get a little extra food. But now, after more research, remoras actually clean some parasites off of the shark, so they help them. So it's now an example of mutualism. Now we talked about parasitism. Let's look at parasitism in more detail. Parasites a lot of times are insects or worms. Annelids are also a type of worm, but they can be other organisms. They will live in or on a host, and that is the other organism they're usually taking something from. The host is always harmed, but it's not usually killed by a parasite. Think about it. If you're getting something for free off of another organism and you kill it, got to find another host. Whereas if you let the host live, okay, I can keep living off of this guy. Both the parasite and the host show adaptations to this relationship. For the parasite, it's usually, how can I get to stay on the host and keep taking stuff without it noticing? And for the host, it's, crap, how do I get rid of this parasite? So one example that you see up here is, this is a tick on a dog. That is a tick right like after it bit a dog and it hasn't fed yet. Then once they feed, they get all bloated and nasty looking. They almost look like scales. So you may have seen those on some of your pets. There's also another specific category I wanted to talk about called social parasites. These parasites don't physically take things from their host, but you have this thing called dump nesting, where organisms, birds called cowbirds, will lay their eggs in other birds' nests. So this guy right here, that is a cowbird. Notice he's bigger than the other chick, so he'll tend to get a lot of the food. The host species ends up, usually some of their chicks will die. Sometimes the cowbird chicks will hatch first and push the other eggs out of the nest. I mean, they really do a lot of harm to the actual host species. So, yeah, that also sucks. Some parasites live outside of the host, so they're attached to the outside. For example, you see up top, that is a flea, which you may have seen on your animals. And here is a head louse, also known as head lice, which you may have had when you were young. Usually these parasites suck out body fluids of some sort. That is a negative effect on their host because they're stealing your nutrients that you've gathered. Also, they can cause irritation. And another bad thing is they can also act as vectors for things that cause disease or pathogens. So for example, lice, rat fleas, mosquitoes, tsetse flies, they can all carry diseases, and if you get bit by them, then you could end up catching those diseases. So some other examples, you have ticks, mites, lice, bed bugs, fleas, all sorts of parasites out there. There are other parasites that live inside the body. So these guys have tons of adaptations to help them stay inside a body. So this example is a tapeworm. Tapeworms have either these hooks or suckers that allow them to attach to the intestinal wall. They have a long, thin body, but it gives them a large surface area so they can suck up nutrients from your digestive system. They also have a thick outer covering called a cuticle that helps to protect them against the digestive enzymes that should be breaking down your food, and would, you would think, break down a tapeworm, but no. Usually there's only one tapeworm living in a person at a time. And so for them to be able to reproduce, they're actually hermaphrodites. So they have both male and female reproductive organs, and they can self-fertilize. So they don't need another tapeworm to make offspring. And then they grow these segments that then pop off and exit in the host species. They're filled with fertilized eggs and free to, continue on passing on tapeworms to other organisms. Also, tapeworms don't have their own digestive system. They got rid of that. They don't need it. You're doing the digestion for them. There are some parasites that have more than one host. They might have a primary host where the parasite becomes sexually mature and able to reproduce, and then a lot of times their larvae will be in like other species. So one example is malaria, whose life cycle is shown here. So malaria live in mosquitoes. A mosquito bites a human. The malaria parasite then moves into the liver of a human and reproduces, destroys some of your liver cells, gets into your blood, destroys some of your blood cells, and then the next time a mosquito bites you, it can pick up those malaria parasites and then pass them on to another person. Plants can actually be parasites too, which I included mostly because you don't usually think of them. So there are some that will kind of, they're only partially jerks in that they photosynthesize, so they make their own food, but they steal nutrients from their host. An example is mistletoe. So I've always found it really funny that mistletoe is used around Christmas, like, oh, people are standing under mistletoe, now they have to kiss. And once I learned it was a plant parasite, I was like, really? You're celebrating that moocher? Then there are actually some plant parasites that have lost the ability to photosynthesize, and they steal everything from their host. This is an example of cancer root, which is a plant parasite. It is technically a plant, but it has adapted so much to being a parasite, it's not green anymore even because it can't photosynthesize. Same thing with some other species like a wood rose. So competition can occur between species or within a species, and it's going to happen wherever you have limited resources in an ecosystem. This happens when you have limiting factors. So the resource is scarce, meaning there is not a lot. So you could say it's rare. And where demand exceeds the supply. More people want that resource than it's available for. So, for example, water is a precious resource if you're somewhere in the desert or if you're somewhere in like a grassland. Apologies. Organisms will often compete for water. So here you see an example of interspecific competition because you see some zebras as well as what look like some antelopes competing for water. Then you can have things like mates. So during mating season, a lot of organisms will compete with each other, and that will be an example of intra-specific competition because they're competing with each other. So here you see two male, look like deer, fighting during mating season. So like I said, competition is for limited resources. Both parties are harmed because compared to how they would be if they didn't have a competitor, they get less resources because someone else is taking some of the resources. So like for example, compare our original comparison, you having a whole pizza, your friend having a whole pizza, that would be great. But if y'all have to split a pizza, then y'all are both getting less resources than you would have originally. So plants tend to compete for things like light, nutrients, water, and they have competition in various ways. So like if they're competing for light, they might grow taller than the other. If they're competing for nutrients or water, they might grow deeper or wider root systems. Animals will compete for food. A lot of times it's the larger or more aggressive individuals, but sometimes it's the smarter ones. So here you see a picture of two dholes, which is a type of, they're related to dogs, but they're not quite dogs, competing over their prey, and they're fighting for it. So there's a number of different types of competition. We've mentioned intraspecific, which is between members of the same species. There's interspecific, between the members of more than one species. There's a couple of other types. Exploitation, where you're directly competing with each other for the same resource. So that would be like you and your friend fighting over that pizza. Interference, you directly compete with another organism, but you prevent them from doing something, like, this is my house, you can't live here, or this is my tree, you can't live here, or like interfering with another organism getting a mate. And then there's an indirect kind of competition, like that's called a parent competition. So it could be you and another species have the same prey, and that species start eating all the prey, and your species starts to suffer because your food source is gone. So there are various responses to competition. It will impact how both individuals grow as well as how populations grow, and also who survives. So in a lot of invertebrates, things like insects and sea creatures, as well as some vertebrates like frogs, the individuals actually will grow slower or grow smaller, and they'll mature at a smaller size than otherwise. So here we have this is a graph showing mean body mass over time for cases where you had 5 tadpoles living in an area, 40 tadpoles in the space the same size, 60, and then 160. Notice that as you increase the number of tadpoles, the growth rate is slower. It takes longer to reach the same growth rate. And then also keep in mind that this line right here is showing you how big a tadpole has to get before it can transition into a frog. Tadpoles are pretty vulnerable. They're stuck in the water, and they're a favorite food source for a lot of things. So it's in their best interest to transition into frogs as soon as possible. The more competition there is, the longer it takes. So here, when there are 160 tadpoles growing in the same spot, it takes them 9 weeks to be able to mature, whereas when there are only 5, they can do that in about 2 weeks. So like I said, it harms everyone involved. So you can reduce competition in various ways. Some species will exploit different food sources. For example, some will have their stages where they'll eat something different than, like, say, earlier in their lifespan, or even have a non-feeding stage. So the example you see up here is an atlas moth. Atlas moth caterpillars feed on a lot of different species, but once they pupate and become an adult, they don't eat anymore. They rely on their stored energy from when they were caterpillars. So therefore, the adults aren't competing with the caterpillars for food. Frog tadpoles tend to eat algae, but the adults usually eat insects and other invertebrates, so they're not competing with each other for food, so that way they're both able to, live in the same area and not affect each other's survival. So there's also competition for mates, and that weird whirly thing is actually a gif of an ostrich doing its courting dance. So you can use any sort of display behavior like that freaky ostrich, or some sort of exaggerated coloration, like think of a peacock, it's very brightly colored. Or you can have organisms get territorial. So for what you see on the bottom, the picture that just showed up is a 3-spined stickleback. And in that, the males actually build these nests under the water. And depending on how attractive those nests are, they will attract females. So the best ones, or the best displays, are going to attract the more members of the opposite gender and give that individual more chances to reproduce. Also, when they're getting really touchy with their territory, it spaces individuals apart, so that way they get enough resources. Otherwise, if everybody just crammed into one space to do all their courtship displays, then everybody would be competing even more for resources. Then let's talk about interspecific competition. What can happen to prevent some interspecific competition is something called niche differentiation. And we'll talk about what niches are later. But a niche is your role in an ecosystem, what you eat, where you live, who you affect, who you eat, all of that. And so if you have 2 different species competing in the same area, they can develop different niches which will reduce their competition. So for example, if you had red squirrels and gray squirrels living in the same area, one of them could eat acorns and the other one could eat a different type of nut. When you have two species that are very similar, that are introduced into circumstances that make them compete with each other directly, usually one of them is going to benefit and the other one's going to be harmed. So for example, in Great Britain, the larger, more aggressive American gray squirrel, our squirrels are mean, were introduced into Great Britain in 1846, and very soon after that, the population of native, smaller, less mean red squirrels started to decrease, and it's decreased dramatically throughout Great Britain. Another thing that organisms can do is called resource partitioning. Partitioning means to split into pieces. So splitting resources up. It's a way of kind of divvying things up, where you can use the same resource in different ways, different locations, or at different times. So a very easy way to resource partition would be, y'all are going to hunt during the day, we're going to hunt during the night. Or like the example that you see here on this picture, you have 5 different species of bird that are living in the same tree. Looks like they're building their nest there, probably getting their food there. But they can all coexist in the same tree because they choose different regions of the tree to live in. So the lighter green area is where each bird lives. So the Blackburnian warbler will live in the outer areas. The black-throated green warbler will live in some central areas, but more medium height. The Cape May warbler will live in the tippy tops. The bay-breasted warbler will live kind of in this middle section, and the yellow-rumped warbler will live on the bottom. So that way they're not directly competing with each other. And so when you have a lot of competition for resources, a lot of organisms will do these niche specializations and this resource partitioning. Rainforests, for example, there's a lot of organisms crammed into a small space, so there's a high population and high species density, so niche specialization and resource partitioning is very common there. Another example, in the African savanna, you have animals that graze, meaning they eat grasses, and others that browse, meaning they eat leaves. So they're living in the same area. They may look similar and occupy some similar niches, but since they eat different foods, they're not directly competing with each other, and they're both able to survive. All right, that is the end of your notes. Stay tuned for the next ones.